The realtor's voice still rang in my ears as I stood in the doorway of the only home I'd ever built with my own two hands. $500,000 cash. Nobody turns that down, son. Behind me, the earthen walls held the morning's first warmth, smooth and curved under my palm like something alive. I'd shaped every inch of them from red clay I'd hauled up a creek bank, one bucket at a time, until my hands bled and then hardened into something that no longer felt the cold. $500,000. Enough to walk away from this patch of dirt forever. Enough to forget the rusty key, the freezing nights, the men in expensive suits who'd circled this land like wolves since before I could remember. But here's the thing. Nobody understood. Not the realtor, not the lawyers, not the strangers who called me the mud hut boy in the papers. This house wasn't just walls and a roof. It was the answer to a question I'd carried for 12 years ever since they told me my grandmother didn't want me. They were wrong about that. About all of it. So, before I tell you why, I said no, I have to take you back to the day I was kicked out at 18 with $200 in my pocket. A bag of secondhand clothes and a debt that was never mine to pay. Because that's where this story really begins. The duffel bag they handed me weighed almost nothing, and somehow it was the heaviest thing I had ever carried. It was state-issued gray canvas gone soft at the corners. The kind of bag that had been packed and unpacked by 100 boys before me. Inside it was everything I owned in the world. 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, a toothbrush, a pair of sneakers worn so thin I could feel the gravel through the soles. 18 years of living, and it all fit in a bag I could sling over one shoulder. I was standing on this curb outside the Cedar County group home on the morning of my 18th birthday, and the building behind me had already stopped being mine. That was how it worked. The day you turned 18, the system was done with you. No cake, no card, just a clipboard and a signature and a polite reminder that your bed was needed for someone younger, someone the state could still collect a check for. The spring air was thick and gray, smelling of wet asphalt and bus exhaust, and the rot of last winter's leaves piling up in the gutters. The city had a way of pressing down on you even on an open street. It got into your clothes and your lungs and the back of your throat, and you stopped noticing it the way a fish stops noticing water. Ms. Pruitt stood beside me, her arms crossed over a thin cardigan, checking her watch the way people check watches when they have somewhere better to be. She had been my caseworker for the last 7 months, which made her the longest relationship I'd had with an adult in years. She wasn't cruel. I want to be fair about that. But she had 40-some kids on her list, and a stack of paperwork that never got shorter. And there is only so much of a person to go around. "You've got your bus ticket," she said. It wasn't a question. "Your birth certificate, your social security card, and this." She handed me a manila envelope already creased and softened at the edges from riding around in her bag. Inside, I knew, was $243 in cash. The last of my state allowance. The whole of my inheritance from a childhood spent in other people's houses. $243. I had counted it 3 times the night before in the dark, under the blanket, like a man trying to make a number larger by staring at it. But it was the other envelope that stopped me. This one she pulled from a separate folder, holding it a moment longer than she needed to, as if she wasn't quite sure she should give it to me at all. It was small, made of thick, cream-colored paper, the kind you don't see anymore, and it was sealed with a blob of wax that had cracked clean down the middle somewhere along the way. My name was written on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize, thin, slanted, old-fashioned, the letters leaning into each other like trees in a wind. Wyatt Holloway. "That came for you a few weeks back," Ms. Pruitt said, "from a law office, out in the eastern part of the state somewhere." She paused. "It's about your grandmother's estate." I felt something turn over in my chest at that word. Grandmother, I want you to understand what that word meant to me. For most of my life, it had meant nothing at all. A blank space. A door that had been closed before I was old enough to remember it opening. My mother died when I was 4. I have only one memory of her, and I'm not even certain it's real. A yellow kitchen sunlight on linoleum. A woman singing something low under her breath while she stirred a pot. My father vanished a short while after the funeral. They told me different things about him over the years. That he'd gone west looking for work. That he'd gotten into trouble. That he simply wasn't the kind of man who stayed. I stopped asking eventually. There is a special kind of tired that comes from asking questions nobody will answer the same way twice. And then there was Marin, my grandmother, my father's mother. She had taken me in for 1 year after my parents were gone, one strange, warm, confusing year. I could only half remember. A house that smelled of baking bread and wood smoke and damp earth. Strong hands that were rough as bark and gentle as anything. A voice that hummed while it worked. And then just like that, social workers and a car ride and a row of metal beds in a long room, and I never saw her again. They told me she couldn't take care of me anymore. That she was old, that she was poor, that she had given me up. I had carried that story for 12 years. She gave me up. I had built my whole self on top of it like a house built on a crack in the foundation. I was the boy nobody wanted. The boy even his own blood couldn't keep. You stop expecting to be chosen when the first lesson you ever learn is that you can be set down and walked away from. Her estate, I said. The word felt absurd in my mouth, 2 sizes too big. I thought she had nothing. Ms. Pruitt gave a small, tired shrug. Apparently, she had a piece of land. She tapped a sheaf of stapled papers clipped to the outside of the small envelope. And according to this, she left it to you, along with a lien against it. She read the next part carefully, the way you read words you don't fully understand. A significant lien, a lien, a debt. A piece of dirt somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, with a string of money tied to it, like a stone tied to a drowning man. I was 18 years old. I had $243 and a bag of secondhand clothes, and now I had a debt I'd never heard of attached to land. I'd never seen left to me by a woman I'd been told had thrown me away. There's a lawyer, she went on, a Mr. Calloway. His number's in there. He said to call once you got settled. She glanced at her watch again, and I saw the conversation ending behind her eyes before her mouth caught up. Your bus leaves in an hour, Wyatt. The ticket's good for the noon line out of Gate 9. She looked at me, then really looked for just a second, and I'd like to tell you there was something there. Some flicker of feeling, some goodbye worth keeping. Maybe there was. Maybe I just needed there to be. Good luck, she said. And then she got into her sensible little sedan and pulled away into the traffic, and the gray river of cars closed over her. And I was alone on a concrete island in the middle of a city that had never once asked my name. I stood there a long time. The bus ticket, when I finally looked at it, was made out for a town called Millhaven. I had never heard of it. I held it up to the light as if the name might mean something, as if a place could tell you in advance what it was going to do to you. It couldn't. It was just a word printed in faded ink, a destination I had no say in. I sat down on a bench by the gate, the duffel between my feet, both envelopes on my lap, and I made myself a quiet promise that I almost didn't keep. I would open the small one, the one in her handwriting. Whatever was inside, I would read it before I decided whether to get on that bus at all. Because I'll tell you the truth, I thought about not going. I thought about tearing the ticket in half. I thought about throwing the iron key when I found it straight into the storm drain at my feet and disappearing back into the city the way water disappears into sand. I knew how to vanish. The system had taught me that much. A young man with no people and no money and no roots is the easiest thing in the world to lose. But my hands were already working at the cracked wax seal. Inside the small envelope were 3 things. A folded deed, yellowed and brittle, describing 5 acres of unincorporated land out on something called Ridge Road. A key, heavy old black iron pitted all over with rust, the kind of key you'd expect to open a church door or a crypt. And a single sheet of that same cream-colored paper, folded in thirds. I opened the letter on my lap. There on the bench, with the noise of the terminal washing over me, and I started to read. And I want you to understand that nothing in my life up to that moment had prepared me for what those words would do. My dear Wyatt, it began. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are a man. I am sorry for so many things, but most of all, I am sorry I had to send you away. I stopped. I read that line again. I read it a 3rd time, my eyes catching on it the way a sleeve catches on a nail. It was not because I did not love you. It was because I did. The terminal sounds went very far away. The world is not always kind, and I had to make a hard choice to keep you safe. I will explain everything, but not all at once, and not here. The land is yours now. It is not much, but it is a beginning. It is clean earth. There is a shelter on it. It will be hard, harder than anything you have known, and you have known hard things. You will be tempted to sell. There are wolves who will come around dressed in fine suits, and they will offer you what sounds like a fortune for your dirt. Do not listen to them. Your true inheritance is not the land itself. It is what you can make of it. Survive the first winter. That is your only task. Everything you need to know you will find there. Be brave. Your grandmother Marin. I sat very still. There are moments in a man's life, and if you've lived long enough, you know exactly what I mean, when the ground you've been standing on your whole life shifts an inch to the left, and suddenly every step you ever took was in the wrong direction. That was what this was. For 12 years, I had been the boy his grandmother gave away. And here, in a dead woman's handwriting in ink that had dried before I ever read it, was a different story entirely. It was not because I did not love you. It was because I did. I didn't cry. Not yet. I was too stunned to cry. But something cracked somewhere deep and old, and through the crack came the first thin draft of a feeling I hadn't let myself feel in years. Hope. Or something close enough to it that I couldn't tell the difference. This was the first turn. The first time the story I'd told myself my whole life proved to be a lie. And I'll be honest with you, it would not be the last. The final boarding call for Millhaven echoed across the terminal. I stood up. I slung the bag over my shoulder. I folded the letter back along its old creases and slid it into my breast pocket over my heart, where I would carry it for a long time. And I walked toward Gate 9, and I got on the bus, and I did not know whether I was walking toward a home or a trap. I only knew that for the first time in my life, I was walking toward an answer. The bus ride was a long, slow unstitching of everything I knew. The city dissolved by degrees. First, the gray towers fell away, then the warehouses and the truck stops, then the strip malls and the chain-link lots, until there was nothing on either side but open country. I had no name for. Fields lay flat and waiting under a pale sky. Then the land began to fold. Low hills came up out of the distance, soft and green and ancient. The oldest mountains in the country, worn down by time into something gentle and enormous. The bus climbed into them, the engine groaning on the grades, and the trees grew tall and close. and the light came down through them in long golden shafts. I had never seen so much green in my life. I had never seen so much of anything that wasn't made of concrete. I tried to sleep and couldn't. My mind ran the same loop over and over. Who were the wolves in suits? What was the debt? What kind of shelter waited for me at the end of this road? And underneath it all, the words from her letter beating like a second pulse. It was not because I did not love you. It was because I did. The other passengers were ghosts, their faces lit blue by the glow of their phones. A young mother with a sleeping child. A man in a faded work jacket staring out the window with the patience of someone who had ridden this route 1,000 times. An old man in the seat across from mine, hands folded in his lap, watching the mountains roll by the way you'd watch an old friend. We were all in transit, all suspended between a place we'd left and a place we hadn't reached. There's a strange kind of fellowship in that. The fellowship of the people just passing through. It was the driver who finally spoke to me. His name tag read Gus, and he had a broad, weathered face and the kind of slow, deep voice that came up out of his chest like water out of a deep well. We'd stopped at a little crossroads station, not even a town, just a gas pump and a diner and a row of pickup trucks. And he caught my eye in the long mirror over the dash. "First time out this way?" he asked. "Something like that," I said. He nodded as if that told him everything. "It's quiet country. Takes some getting used to if you're from the city." His eyes moved over my thin jacket, my worn sneakers, the duffel bag tucked between my feet, and there was no judgment in it. Only a kind of weathered understanding. Folks out here move at the speed of the seasons, not the speed of traffic. You'll learn that or you won't. "I've got a place out here," I said. "Inherited some land." Something flickered in his eyes. Interest. Maybe respect. "That's so." He turned back to the road as the bus pulled out. "Well, land's the one thing they ain't making any more of, son. Whatever else you do, you hold on to it." He said it lightly, the way men say things they've said many times. But it lodged in me. Land's the one thing they ain't making any more of. I would think of those words many times in the months to come, on the nights when I was ready to quit. Sometimes the most important thing a man ever tells you, he tells you without knowing he's done it. It was late afternoon when the bus finally pulled into Millhaven. The town was smaller than anything I had imagined. One main street paved long ago and patched many times. A row of brick storefronts, half of them empty, their windows papered over. A general store with a faded soda sign hanging crooked over the door. A post office no bigger than a tool shed. A diner with a neon sign that flickered weakly even in the daylight, as if it had been left on too long and forgotten. I was the only one who got off. The bus hissed and groaned and pulled away behind me, and then there was a silence so complete it rang in my ears. After 18 years in the city, silence was a thing I had never truly heard. There was birdsong somewhere and wind in the high trees, and far off the trickle of water, and underneath it all a vast patient quiet that made the city in my memory seem like a fever I was only now waking from. The town watched me. A woman sweeping the porch of the general store stopped her broom and looked. An old man on a bench by the post office lowered his newspaper an inch. I was a stranger here, a foreign object dropped into a closed and careful world, and they all knew it the moment I stepped down onto the curb. I checked the deed again. The address wasn't really an address, just a route number, and a lot description that meant nothing to me. I walked up the steps of the general store, and a bell jangled over my head as I pushed open the door. The inside smelled of sawdust and coffee and old wood, a clean smell, an honest one. The woman from the porch came back in behind me and went around the counter. She had gray hair pulled back tight, and a pair of glasses she looked at me over the top of, and her face was the kind that gave nothing away until it decided to. "Help you?" she asked. Not unkind, but careful. I laid the deed on the counter. "I'm looking for this place." She picked it up and read it, and I watched her face change, slowly, like watching weather come in. "That's the old Holloway plot," she said. "Out on Ridge Road, maybe 4 miles east." She pointed out the window down the street to where the paving gave out, and a gravel road climbed away into the trees. "Nobody's lived out there in years, not since she passed." The way she said it, I knew who she meant. "You family?" she asked. "Her grandson," I said. The words came out quieter than I meant them to. Something moved behind her glasses then. Surprise. And under it, something softer. She set the deed down on the counter as gently as if it were made of glass. "Well, I'll be," she said. "You're Wyatt." I felt the floor go strange under my feet. "You know my name. Your grandmother talked about you." Her voice had lost all its wariness now. More than she talked about anything. Worried about you something fierce right up to the end. Wondered where you'd gotten to. Whether you were warm. Whether you were fed. She looked at me a long moment. She was a good woman, Marin Holloway. Kept to herself mostly. But good people. The best kind. The kind that don't tell you they're good. They just are. And you only find out later. I didn't know what to say. I don't think there were words for what was happening inside me. For 12 years, my grandmother had been a closed file, a legal problem, a name on a form. And here was a stranger in a small store in a small town telling me she had been a person who worried about whether I was warm, whether I was fed, who carried me in her mind right up to the end of her life. The woman, her name was Della, she told me. Della Marsh run that store 30 years, took a bottle of water and a bag of apples down off the shelf and put them in a paper sack and slid it across the counter to me. When I reached for my money, she shook her head. "You'll want that for the walk," she said. "And the well out there'll need priming. There's a pump handle in the shed. Work it slow and steady or it'll never catch." It was a small thing. A bottle of water and a bag of apples. But I want you to understand, it was the first time in longer than I could remember that anyone had given me something without my having to earn it. Fight for it or be grateful in a way that left me smaller. I walked out of that store carrying more than groceries. I carried the first proof I'd had in years that the world might still have some kindness left in it for a boy like me. The walk was long. The gravel road climbed steadily out of town, and where the gravel ran out, it became a dirt track. 2 ruts with grass growing up the middle, flanked on both sides by forests so thick and tall, it closed over my head like the roof of a cathedral. The light came down green and broken. The air went cool and damp and smelled of pine, and turned earth and something I couldn't name, something old. The silence was deeper here than in town. I heard my own footsteps. I heard my own breathing. I heard the blood in my ears. I felt small. An intruder in a world that had been here long before me, and would be here long after I was dust. And then the track opened into a clearing, and there it was. My inheritance. I had imagined a house, a cabin maybe. Something with a porch, a chimney, a window with a light in it. What I got instead was a tin can. It was a Quonset hut. You know the kind, that long, low half-cylinder of corrugated steel, like a giant pipe cut in half and laid on its side. The kind they threw up by the thousands during the war, and after, when men needed shelter fast and cheap and ugly didn't matter. This one had stood for decades. The corrugated metal was rusted in long, weeping streaks. dull orange, bleeding down the dull gray, angry against the bright green of the wilderness pressing in around it. A single crooked stovepipe stuck up out of the roof at a sad angle. A few small windows were cut into the curved sides, one of them cracked clean across, and the glass was so grimed over you couldn't see in. It wasn't a home. It wasn't even a shed a man would keep his tools in. And something in me, some last small flame of hope I'd been carrying since the bus station guttered and went out, this was it. This was the legacy. This was what 12 years of separation. What a lifetime of sacrifice. What it was not because I did not love you. It was because I did. This was what all of it had come down to. A rusted tin tube in a clearing at the end of a dirt road 4 miles from the nearest other human being. The absurdity of it was so total I almost laughed. I had traded a warm, clean bed in a group home for this, but her words came back to me. There is a shelter there. I looked at the hut and then back at the dark wall of forest behind me. And however bleak it was the only thing standing between me and the wilderness. The light was already going. I didn't have a choice, and I knew it. I took a breath that did nothing to settle my hammering heart, and I walked up to the wooden door, and I worked the iron key into the old lock. It resisted. It grated. And then, with a deep, protesting clunk that I felt in my teeth, it turned and the door swung inward and I stepped out of the dying daylight and into the dark. The air inside was cold and still and thick with the smell of dust and rust and the dry musk of mice. A single shaft of late light came in through the open door and lit a slow galaxy of floating dust. The interior was one long curved room, the steel ribs of the structure showing along the ceiling like the bones of some great beached animal. The floor was concrete, cracked and uneven, with a dark stain in one corner where water had been getting in. Against one wall stood a squat iron stove, pot-bellied, with a neat stack of firewood beside it. A wooden table with one chair. A narrow cot with a thin stained mattress. And a set of rough shelves holding a handful of tin plates, a single chip mug, and a small row of books. That was all. That was everything. I walked the length of the place, my footsteps echoing off the curved walls, and I ran my hand along the cold steel, and it came away damp. This building would not survive a winter. I knew it the way you know a thing in your gut before your head can argue with it. It would be a frozen, dripping tomb come December, and I would freeze in it, or I would crawl back to town defeated and broke. The anger came up then, hot and sudden. This was the protection she'd written about. This was her love, leaving an 18-year-old boy to freeze in a rusted tin can, while strangers in suits hounded him over a debt that wasn't his. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive my fist through the rusted wall. I wanted to walk the 4 miles back to that bus stop and use the last of my money to ride to anywhere on earth that wasn't here. But I was tired. Bone tired. The kind of tired that goes deeper than one long day and one sleepless night. It was the tired of a whole life spent never knowing where I'd lay my head next. I sank down into the single chair, and it groaned beneath me, and I dropped my face into my hands. And the silence of that place pressed down on me like a hand on the back of my neck. This was rock bottom. I was sure of it. A rusted hut on a patch of dirt nobody wanted, with a dead woman's riddles for company. And that was when I saw the box. It was on the shelf behind the little row of books. Books on edible plants, on basic carpentry, on something called natural building, and it was wrong somehow. It didn't belong. Everything else in that hut was rough and worn and forgotten. But this small wooden box was smooth and dark and deliberately placed. It hadn't been left behind. It had been left. For me. The way you set something down where you know a particular person will look. Everything you need to know you will find there. My heart started to beat faster. I got up and crossed the room and took it down. It was heavier than it looked. I carried it back to the table, set it down, and stood over it a moment. My breath caught somewhere high in my chest. There was no lock, just a small brass clasp. I lifted the lid. Inside, on a bed of faded velvet, were two things. A thick stack of letters tied with plain string, and a leather-bound journal, its cover soft and worn from handling. The letter on top of the stack had my name on it, the same thin, slanted hand. Wyatt. I pulled the stack out, and my fingers were shaking so badly I could barely work the string loose. I unfolded the first letter, and I read it there in the last of the light, and my whole world got smaller and smaller, until there was nothing in it but those words. Wyatt, it began. If you have found this box, it means you did not turn back. It means there is a part of you, a part of me that is a fighter. That gives me more hope than you will ever know. She had known. She had known I would want to run. She had reached out across death itself to catch me at the exact moment I was ready to quit. I need you to understand why I sent you away. The letter went on. It is the great regret of my life, and the one act I am most proud of. Your father, my son, was not a bad man at heart, but he was a weak one. He fell in with some very dangerous people. A lending outfit dressed up as a development company. They called themselves Blackwater Land and Development. They got him into debt deeper and deeper, and when he could not pay, they used him. And when your mother died and he ran, they turned their eyes to the only thing of his they could still get a hold of. They turned their eyes to you. My breath stopped in my throat. They wanted this land, Wyatt. They had wanted it for years for reasons I did not fully understand at first. And they saw you as their way to get it. A grandson is leverage. A child is a lever you can pry a person open with. They made it clear to me in ways I could not prove, and the law would not touch that. As long as you were with me, you were a target. The authorities were no use. These men were experts at standing just inside the line of the law. So I had a choice. I could keep you with me and live every day in terror for your life, or I could send you away into a system I knew was cold and lonely, but where you would be anonymous, where you would be safe. A boy lost in the system is a boy they cannot find. I chose to let you go so that you could live. It broke my heart into 1,000 pieces, and I have carried every single one of them, every single day since. I had to stop reading. I put the letter down on the table, and I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, and for the first time in more years than I could count, I wept. Not the angry, choking tears of a boy who's been wronged. Something older than that. Something deeper. I wept for the 4-year-old who lost his mother. I wept for the 5-year-old who was driven away from the only warm house he'd ever known and never knew why. I wept for the teenager who lay awake in a row of metal beds, learning to hate the grandmother, who it turned out had given up everything to save him. 12 years. 12 years I had believed I was unwanted. 12 years I had built my whole self on that lie. And it had never been true, not for one single day. I wasn't abandoned. I was protected. I was loved so fiercely that a woman had chosen a lifetime of lonely grief over the risk of losing me. She had let the world believe she'd throw me away. Had let me believe it because the truth would have painted a target on my back. When the worst of it passed, and it took a long while, I picked the letter back up. My hands were steadier now. I needed to know the rest. The lien on this land, she wrote, the $25,000 they say you owe, that is the last of your father's debt. It was never yours. It was never even truly his. It was a debt manufactured by men who profit from manufacturing debts, signed under a kind of pressure that should be a crime, and somehow is not. When I refused to sell them this land, they attached the debt to the property itself. It is their hook, their leash, their way of forcing your hand once I was gone. They will assume you are a desperate, friendless boy who will sell 5 acres of dirt for the price of forgiving a debt that isn't real. They will offer to wipe it away if you sign. It will feel like mercy. It will feel like the only smart thing to do. Do not sign anything. Do not sell. Mr. Calloway, the lawyer, is a good and honest man. He was my friend, and he knows the whole truth of it. He will help you when the time comes. But the time is not yet. First, you must do the one thing that will change everything. First, you must make this place your own. There it was. The second turn. The debt wasn't mine. It had never been mine. It was a fiction, a manufactured chain designed by men who'd never met me to drag a boy they'd never seen into the ground before he ever learned to stand. And the woman everyone had told me was poor and helpless and broken. She had seen the whole thing coming, and she had laid a trap of her own. The letter went on to describe the land, the well and how to prime it, the little garden plot she had tilled for years, gone to weeds now, but still good earth. And then it turned to the hut itself. The shelter is ugly, she wrote, and I could almost hear her saying it, dry and plain. I know. It was all I could afford to put up in a hurry in the days when I still thought I might raise you here. It is a skin of cold metal. It will not keep out the winter as it stands. You have felt that already, I expect, standing inside it, with your heart in your boots. But here is what the men in suits do not understand, and what I am going to teach you. The earth remembers. Our people knew how to build with what the ground gave them, long before anyone poured concrete or rolled out steel. On the eastern edge of this land down by the creek, you will find a deep deposit of clay, red as old brick and twice as fine. The journal in this box will teach you everything: how to mix the clay with sand and with straw, how to test it, how to work it, how to lay it on in courses. It is called cob. With it, you can give this ugly tin shell a new skin, a thick, warm, breathing skin of earth 2 feet through at the base that no wind can shake and no winter can chill. It will be the hardest work you have ever done. It will take you all summer and into the fall, and there will be days you want to lie down and quit. But if you do it, if you wrap this cold, dead metal in living earth with your own 2 hands, then you will have a home that is truly yours, and you will have earned your inheritance. I set the letter down and looked around me at the cold steel ribs, at the cracked floor, at the single weak shaft of dying light. Cover a building in mud, wrap a tin can in clay and straw, and turn it into a house. It sounded insane. It sounded like a fairy story. I was a city kid. I knew asphalt and concrete and chain link. I had never built anything in my life. I had never grown anything fixed, anything made anything with my hands beyond a sandwich. But I picked up the journal, and when I opened it, I understood that my grandmother had not left me a riddle. She had left me a manual. The pages were filled with her elegant, slanting hand, and with careful drawings done in pencil. Sketches of the hut with the thick, sculpted earthen walls wrapped around it, soft and curved where the metal was hard and straight. Recipes for mixing cob with the proportions worked out 3 different ways. Diagrams showing how to test the soil by rolling it into a ball. How to do the ribbon test. how to read the clay, instructions for building up the walls in layers, how thick, how to let each course set before adding the next, notes on doors and windows and how to set glass into wet earth. It was all there. Years of knowledge distilled and written down by hand, page after page, in the language of a woman who knew her grandson would one day be reading it alone in the dark. And then near the back, the journal changed. The drawings stopped. The recipes stopped. And in their place came something else entirely. Dates, names, amounts, line after line after line of them. March 14th. Phone call, block number. Man would not give his name. Said Blackwater was prepared to be generous, but that generosity has a deadline. May 2nd. Letter from Blackwater attorney. Third one this year. Offer down again. They know I cannot afford the property taxes much longer. They are waiting me out. August 19th. A man came to the gate, took photographs of the hut. Would not say why. When I asked him to leave, he smiled and said, "Property changes hands all the time, ma'am, one way or another." November 30th. Heard from C that the Tillman family sold out and left the county. That makes 9 families on the ridge. They are buying up everything. I am one of the last. It went on for pages, years of it, a decade of it. Every threatening call, every lowball offer, every veiled menace from every man in every cheap suit they ever sent up that long dirt road to lean on an old woman alone in a tin hut at the end of the world. She had written it all down, every single piece. Dated, detailed, witnessed where she could manage it. She had been building a case, a record, a weapon to put in the hands of whoever came after her. She had been fighting Blackwater land and development alone in silence for more than 10 years. And now the fight was mine. That was the third turn, and it was the one that changed me. Because up to that point I had thought of my grandmother as a victim, a poor old woman who had her grandson taken and her land coveted, and who had died alone in a rusted shed. A sad story. A defeated one. But she wasn't defeated. She had never once been defeated. While they thought they were grinding her down, while they thought she was just a stubborn old woman, too foolish to take their money, she had been documenting every move they made, squirreling away a legal fund with the only lawyer she trusted, and writing a manual to turn the very shelter they wanted to seize into a fortress they could never take. She had been laying a trap for 10 years, and the bait in the trap was me, not me, the lever, the way Blackwater saw me, but me, the heir. Me, the fighter she swore I'd turn out to be. She hadn't left me a tomb. She had left me an arsenal. The sun had gone all the way down now, and the hut was plunged into a darkness more complete than any I had ever known. There was no glow of a city on the horizon out here, no streetlight, no screen. Just black and the cooling tick of the metal as it gave up the day's small warmth, and somewhere far off the long, low call of an owl. I sat at that table in the dark, the journal closed under my hands, and I felt the whole weight of it settle onto my shoulders. The debt, the company, the decade-long war I had just inherited, the impossible task of building a house out of mud with hands that had never built anything. I was 18 years old. I had no skills. I had no money, $240-some that would feed me for a few weeks if I was careful. And then nothing. I had no one. The whole of it should have crushed me flat. And part of me wanted it to. Part of me in that dark still wanted to run. To take the developer's money when it came, sign their paper, pay off their fake debt, and walk away with whatever was left, and a clean start somewhere far from here. But I thought about her hand moving across those pages year after lonely year. I thought about a woman choosing a broken heart over a broken boy. I thought about the apples in the paper sack, and Della saying she worried about you something fierce. I thought about Gus's slow voice. Land's the one thing they ain't making any more of, son. You hold on to it. And I thought about the lie I'd carried for 12 years. The lie that I was the boy nobody wanted, and how it had turned out here in the dark at the end of the road to be the exact opposite of the truth. I had been wanted. I had been chosen. I had been fought for by a woman who never once stopped fighting right up to the day she laid down her pen and her life and trusted the rest of it to me. I didn't sleep much that first night. I lay on the thin cot under a single scratchy wool blanket, and the cold came up out of the concrete and through the metal frame and into my bones, and every gust of wind rattled the steel skin of the hut and sounded in my fear like something circling outside in the dark. I lay there with my eyes open, staring up at the black where the ceiling should be, and I was more afraid than I had ever been in my life. But somewhere in the long hours before dawn, the fear changed into something else. It didn't go away. I want to be honest about that fear. Like that doesn't just go away, not in one night, not ever really. But it made room for something to sit beside it. A small, hard, stubborn thing. A thing that had been buried under 12 years of being told I was nothing. She had called me a fighter, and lying there in the cold and the dark in a rusted tin can, at the end of the world, with a dead woman's letters over my heart, and a decade-old war on my shoulders, I decided for the first time in my whole life, with no one telling me what to do, or where to sleep, or when to eat, I decided who I was going to be. When the first gray light finally came creeping in through the grimy windows, when the formless terror of the night resolved itself back into a forest, into trees taking shape one by one, into birdsong, starting up thin and clear in the cold air, I sat up on that cot, and the blanket fell away, and I was still afraid, and I was no longer alone with it. I had survived the first night. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a defeat either. And my grandmother's voice was in my head steady and plain, the way it would be in my head every hard day to come. Survive the first winter. That is your only task. Winter was a long way off. The whole green summer stood between me and it. And the task in front of me that morning wasn't the whole winter, wasn't the whole war, wasn't the whole impossible house of earth. The task that morning was simply to begin. I got up off that cot, stiff and cold and 18 years old, and I went to the little iron stove, and I knelt down in front of it. I had never built a fire in my life, but I had watched it done once or twice in the movies and in the homes I'd passed through. I reached into the stack of legal notices I'd carried in with me, the demands for payment, the foreclosure warnings, the threats from Blackwater Land and Development, printed on heavy paper with a gold seal at the top, and I tore one in half and I crumpled it into kindling. And I have to tell you, there was a grim satisfaction in watching their threats curl up and catch and turn to ash. It took 3 tries. The first flame caught and died. The second caught and died. The third one held a small, hesitant, trembling thing, and I bent down close and breathed on it, slow and steady, the way you'd coax anything fragile into living, and it grew. It crept along the kindling and reached up into the small split logs and steadied into a real fire, and a little pocket of warmth opened up against the great cold dark of that hut, and I crouched there in front of it with my hands held out to the heat. It was the smallest thing, a fire in a stove, a boy keeping himself warm, but it was mine. I had made it, and it was the first thing in my whole life I had ever made with my own 2 hands. I picked up my grandmother's journal and I found an old bucket in the corner, and I pushed open the wooden door and stepped out into the cold, bright morning, into the clearing, into the new day, with the dew still silver on the grass and the mist still lying in the low places among the trees. I was going down to the creek. I was going to find that clay. The creek ran cold and fast at the eastern edge of the land, just as she'd written it would. I followed the sound of it down through the trees, the bucket banging against my leg, the journal tucked inside my jacket against my chest. The ground sloped away under a carpet of fallen leaves gone soft and black, with years of rot, and the woods grew thicker the lower I went, the morning mist still hanging in the hollows where the sun hadn't reached. I pushed through ferns wet to the waist and slick green undergrowth, and then the trees opened, and there was the water running clear and quick over stones. And there where the bank had caved in along one bend was a long exposed seam of earth. It was a different color from everything around it. The topsoil was dark, almost black, but this was reddish-brown, the color of old brick, the color of rust, the color of dried blood. I knelt down at the edge of the water and worked my fingers into it, and it gave way slow and heavy, and I pulled out a fistful and held it up. It was cool. It was dense. It was smooth and sticky, and held the shape of my hand when I closed my fist around it. I rolled it into a ball in my palm the way the journal said to, and the ball held smooth and unbroken. Clay. I knelt there a long time just holding it, the water running by the light coming down through the canopy in shifting coins of gold. There's a thing that happens to a man when he holds raw earth in his hand and understands all at once that he is holding the thing that's gonna save his life. It felt ancient. It felt older than the company, older than the debt, older than every cruel and clever thing men in suits had ever done to families on this ridge. The earth remembers she'd written. I believed her now. I could feel it in my hand. I filled the bucket. It took both arms and most of my back to carry it up the slope, and by the time I reached the clearing, my shoulders were burning and my breath was ragged. I dumped the clay onto an old tarp I found folded behind the hut, and I went back down for more. And then I went back down again. By midday, I had a wet red mound the size of a small dog and a pile of sand I dug from a dry bend of the creek. And my hands and arms and face were smeared with red, and I had never in my life been so tired or so strangely, fiercely glad. The straw was the problem. The journal called for chopped straw mixed into the clay, and sand long fibers, it said, to bind the whole thing together, the way the steel rebar binds concrete. But I had no straw. I had no idea where a man even got straw. So that first afternoon I made do pulling up handfuls of the dry, dead grass that grew in patches around the clearing, chopping it short with the edge of an old shovel. And I mixed up my first batch right there on the tarp. I want you to picture it, because I'll never forget it. An 18-year-old city boy alone in a clearing in the mountains, barefoot on a sheet of mud, stomping and shuffling and treading clay and sand and grass together under a hot sun, sweating, swearing, getting it wrong, getting it a little less wrong, the way a man learns anything by doing it badly and refusing to stop. I made test bricks the way the journal said to, a ball of pure clay which cracked clean through as it dried, a mix of clay and sand, better but still brittle as a stale cracker. And then the clay and sand and chopped grass together molded into a small loaf and set out in the sun on a flat stone. By late afternoon, when the light went long and gold across the clearing, that last brick was dry. I picked it up. It was lighter than I expected light, as a stone full of holes. And when I gripped it in both hands and tried to break it, I couldn't. I tried again harder until the cord stood out in my neck and it held. It would not break. I had made something. Out of dirt and grass and water and nothing else, with my own 2 hands, I had made a thing that would not break. I sat down right there in the dirt, and I held that brick, and I felt something move through me that I didn't have a name for then, and I'm not sure I have one now. Pride, maybe. But bigger than pride. The feeling of a man discovering late and against all odds that he is good for something after all. That night I huddled by the stove and ate an apple from Della's sack and drank from the well I'd primed slow and steady till it caught just like she said. And I was not afraid. I was too tired to be afraid. It was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes up out of honest work. A kind of tired I had never once felt in 18 years of being moved from bed to bed by people who decided things about me, without me. I had made one small brick. One. Against a wall the length of a bus, and a winter coming on, and a company that had crushed 9 families before me. It was nothing, but it was a beginning. And I had chosen it. For the first time in my life, I had chosen. The weeks that followed were a brutal education in what a man's body can do when it has no other choice. My days fell into a rhythm hard as the work itself. Up at dawn before the heat. Down to the creek with the buckets, fill them, haul them up the slope, and let me tell you, a bucket of wet clay is a cruel thing to carry uphill. It pulls at every muscle from your fingers to your spine, and you do it again and again and again. Then the sand. Then the water from the well. Then the mixing, which the journal called treading, which meant spreading it all out on the tarp in the right measures, and then dancing on it, stomping it, working it together with my bare feet for an hour, 2 hours, until it became a single smooth, heavy paste. Then the straw, the dead grass in those first weeks, chopped and folded in and trodden again. My body, soft from years of sitting still in institutional rooms, screamed. My back seized up so bad, some mornings I had to roll off the cot and crawl to the stove before I could stand straight. My hands went from soft to raw, to a ruin of broken blisters, and the blisters wept and stung and finally slowly hardened into calluses thick as leather. I lost the softness in my face. I lost the softness everywhere. I caught my reflection in the cracked window one evening, lean and brown and red-smeared and unshaven, and I did not recognize the boy who'd stepped off that bus. He was gone. Something else was taking his place, one bucket of clay at a time. The applying of it was the reward at the end of each day. I started on the north wall, the wall that would take the worst of the winter wind. The journal told me so. Build it first, and build it thick. I'd take a loaf-sized lump of the cob and press it against the cold corrugated steel, working it down into the grooves, building it up layer on layer, smoothing it with the flat of my hand. It looked ridiculous at first, a man throwing mud at a wall. I'd step back at the end of a long day's labor and see how little I'd done, a single patch no bigger than a door. And then I'd look at the vast curving expanse of bare rusted metal still to go, and the old despair would rise up in me like floodwater. One person, 2 hands. A mountain. On those days, and there were many of them, I'd go inside and light the lamp and open her journal, and her voice would come up off the page and steady me. Do not look at the whole wall, Wyatt. You will drown if you look at the whole wall. Look only at the next handful. The wall will build itself one handful at a time if you will only keep putting up the next handful and refuse to count the ones still to come. She was right. God, she was right about everything. I learned to narrow my eyes to the next lump of cob, the next step in the slow, muddy dance, the next handful, and only the next handful. And slowly, so slowly that some days I couldn't see it. and only knew it by looking at where I'd been a week before. A section of that north wall began to disappear under a thick, undulating living skin of red earth. It looked strange. It looked like the hut was growing something, like the metal was being healed over from the outside in. It was somewhere in that stretch, the deep heat of full summer, the long, brutal days that the truck came. I heard it before I saw it, an engine laboring up the dirt track, and my whole body went cold and still the way a deer goes still. They've come. I stood there in the clearing with cob drying on my arms, every nerve singing, and a battered pickup nosed into the clearing and stopped. And a man got out, late 50s, maybe 60. A kind, lined, weathered face, wearing a suit that had been good 20 years ago and was now soft and rumpled with use. He looked at me, and then he looked at the hut, at the patch of north wall I'd covered, and a slow smile broke across his whole face. "Wyatt Holloway," he said. It wasn't a question. He came toward me with his hand out. "David Calloway. I was your grandmother's attorney." He took my muddy hand in both of his and shook it firm and unhurried. "And I'm proud to say her friend." We sat at the wooden table inside, and that was the first time I felt plain as anything what the cob was already doing. The sun was beating down hard on the metal roof, and where the bare steel was, you could feel the heat radiating off it like an open oven. But over by the north wall, where the earth was already 2 handspans thick, the air was cool. Cool as a cellar. I put my palm flat against the inside of that wall, and it was cool to the touch, and I looked at Calloway, and he was watching me figure it out. And he nodded slow. 2 feet of earth, he said. Keeps the heat out in July and the cold out in January. People forget we knew how to do this once, before we decided everything had to be quick and cheap and made of plastic. He looked around the long, curved room at the steel ribs overhead, at the journal on the table. She talked about this, wrapping the old hut in cob, year after year. I thought it was just an old woman's dream. He looked at the wall again, and something moved across his face. Turns out it was a set of instructions. Then he laid it out for me. The whole thing, plain and simple, the way you'd explain it to a man who needed to understand it, because his life depended on it. Blackwater land and development was a shell, a clean front for something much larger and much worse. A firm out of the city that had been quietly buying up the unincorporated land all over the county for the better part of 15 years. Predatory lending, manufactured debt, tax pressure on folks who could barely make ends meet. One family at a time, one ridge at a time, leaning and squeezing and waiting people out until they signed and left. Your grandmother's 5 acres, he said, were a piece of something, a puzzle they've been trying to put together for years. I never knew the whole of why she never knew the whole of why not at first. But they wanted this land bad enough to spend a decade on one stubborn old woman. That tells you something. The debt, I said. The lien, he nodded. $25,000. It's the leftover of your father's debt to them, a debt I'd argue, till I'm blue, was fraudulent from the start, signed under duress by a man with a gun to his head, so to speak. But it's on paper, and they attached it to this property when Marin wouldn't sell. It's their crowbar. Their plan is simple. They foreclose. They count on you being a broke, friendless 18-year-old who can't pay and can't fight. So you either fold and sign the land over to clear the debt, or they take it at auction. Either way, they win, and they walk away with what they've wanted all along. He paused. They've already filed the preliminary paperwork. The clock is running. My stomach dropped right through the cracked concrete floor. So what do I do? And here's where the old man surprised me. He didn't tell me to lawyer up. He didn't tell me to fight on paper. He pointed at the wall. You keep doing exactly what you're doing, he said. Every handful of that mud you put on this hut, You're doing the most important legal work there is. You're establishing residency. You're making improvements to the property. You're showing to a court, to a judge, to anybody who comes looking a clear, undeniable intent to live here. To make this your home. He leaned forward. In the eyes of the law, son, that matters more than you can imagine. There's a world of difference between a squatter on worthless dirt and a man who built his own home with his own two hands. One you can sweep off the land. The other, he shook his head, the other you have to fight, and people don't like watching a thing like that get taken away. He told me my grandmother had left a small fund in his trust. Not for me to live on, she'd been specific about that, but to cover the legal fees when the fight came. She had known it was coming. She had armored me before I was even old enough to understand I'd need armor. She didn't just leave you a piece of land. Wyatt, Calloway said, standing, gathering his hat. She left you a strategy. Your job is to make it real. Every wall you raise, you're writing your own defense. When they come to take your home, we're going to stand up in that courtroom and show them you didn't inherit a property. You built a home. That changes the whole story. You're not a squatter. You're a homesteader. He put his hat on. And I have never once in 40 years of law seen a judge enjoy throwing a homesteader out of a house he raised with his bare hands. He left me a stack of papers to sign, and something far more valuable than papers. He left me a reason. Up to that day, the mudslinging had been about survival, about not freezing, about one boy keeping himself alive through one coming winter. But now every handful of cob was something more. It was a stake driven into the ground. It was a sentence in a defense being written one trowel at a time. This is mine. I am here. I am not leaving. I worked harder after that. I didn't think I could, but I did. And the strangest thing began to happen all through that deep green summer. The town came to me. It started small. Della at the general store began setting aside the bruised fruit and the day-old bread, and she'd never say a word about it. Just push a paper sack across the counter on the rare days I walked into town for nails or twine. And when I tried to pay, she'd look at me over her glasses like I'd said something foolish. Then one morning, an old farmer came up the track in a flatbed truck. Silas Ott lived a few miles down the ridge, a man so weathered and lean he looked carved out of the same hard root as the trees. He didn't say hello. He stood at the edge of the clearing with his thumbs in his belt and watched me work for the better part of an hour. His eyes narrow and critical, saying nothing while I sweated and slapped cob on the wall and tried to pretend a stranger wasn't judging every move I made. Finally, he spoke. "You're working it too wet," he said. His voice was a low gravel. "Let your mix set up some before you put it on the wall, or it'll slump on you and crack when it dries. And that grass," he spat to one side, "too short. You need long fibers if you want a strong bind. That'll fall apart in a hard freeze." He turned and got back in his truck and drove off without another word, and I stood there feeling like a fool. But the next morning he was back, and in the bed of that flatbed were 2 big golden bales of oat straw from his own barn. He set them down at the edge of the clearing himself, brushed off his hands, and looked at the hut. "Marin was a good neighbor," was all he said. He wouldn't take $1. He just got in his truck and left, and I stood there in the clearing with 2 bales of the best binder a man could ask for, and something tight in my chest came loose. After that, things began appearing at the end of my track down where it met the road. A burlap sack of potatoes left in the cool morning, a mason jar of put-up pickles, a second jar of honey, dark as amber, and one day, sitting on a flat stone like an offering, a pair of work boots, broken in but with plenty of wear left that fit me and I will never understand this that fit me perfectly, as if they'd been measured. I want to be careful how I say this, because it matters. These were not acts of pity. I had lived my whole life on the receiving end of pity, and I knew exactly what it tasted like. And this wasn't it. This was something else. This was solidarity. I understood it slowly over the weeks, in the way Silas looked at the hut, in the way Della's mouth tightened when the name Blackwater came up. Every one of these people had been leaned on. Every one of them had gotten the phone calls, the lowball letters, the man at the gate with the camera, and the easy smile. Some of them had watched neighbors fold and sell and leave. 9 families gone from the ridge, my grandmother's journal had said. My fight was their fight. And an old woman who'd spent 10 years fighting it alone had finally left them a grandson stubborn enough to fight it out loud. I wasn't alone anymore. That was the gift of that summer. And I didn't fully see it till later. A boy who'd grown up believing the entire world had decided he wasn't worth keeping was learning handful by handful that a whole town had quietly decided he was worth helping. The work transformed me, and it transformed the hut. With the oat straw long, strong, golden fibers, and Silas's advice about letting the mix set up, my cob got stronger and the walls got faster. I learned the personality of the clay, how it felt on a dry day versus the heavy heat after rain, when to add water and when to hold back. My body had gone hard and capable. I could carry 2 full buckets up the slope now without stopping. I could tread a batch in half the time it used to take me. The blisters were long gone, the calluses thick. I had a tan that wouldn't wash off, and a strength in my arms and back that hadn't been there in June. And the hut. The hut was becoming something I could hardly believe I was making. It was no longer a tin can. The cold, straight lines of the corrugated steel were vanishing month by month under thick, soft, sculptural walls of red earth. 2 feet through at the base, gently curved, organic, alive. I'd started carving into the surface while it was still soft, swirling lines that echoed the run of the creek. I'd built up a thick, arched doorway rounded and deep as the door of an old church. And on a whim one evening, half mad with the loneliness and wanting to put something beautiful into the world, I'd pushed a row of empty glass bottles into the wet cob. Green ones, brown ones, an old blue medicine bottle I'd found in the weeds, so their open ends caught the light. Now, in the late afternoon, the sun came through those bottles and threw jewels of green and gold and blue across the inside of my home, and I would sit and watch them move across the floor as the sun went down, and I would think, I made this. A boy with nothing made this. It was the deep heat of August when the world reminded me the way it always does that it was not done testing me yet. I'd finished the whole north wall and most of the east, and I'd let it cure in the long, dry days, weeks of it hard and strong as fired brick. I was proud of that wall, prouder than I'd been of anything in my life. It was the part that faced the road and the worst of the weather, both the first thing a man would see coming up the track, and I'd worked it smooth and carved it careful and set my best bottles in it. It was the face of my home. It was the sentence in my defense that said, loudest of all, I am here, and I am not leaving. That was the wall they came for. I woke deep in the night to a sound I couldn't place, a hard, wet, repeated thud, like a fist into a side of meat, and under it the low murmur of a voice, and then a sharper sound, the bright crack of glass. For one frozen second I lay on the cot in the dark and told myself it was a dream, an animal, the wind. Then I was on my feet and out the door, barefoot into the black, my heart slamming, and I rounded the corner of the hut to the north face, and a flashlight beam swung up and caught me full in the eyes and held there blinding. I couldn't see them. 2 of them maybe just shapes behind the light, but I could see what they'd done. They had pickaxes or pry bars, something heavy. They had been at the wall, my finished, cured, beautiful wall for I don't know how long. Great wet wounds had been torn out of it, whole sections caved in and crumbling. My bottles smashed to glittering ruin on the ground. Weeks of work. Months. The face of my home broken open in the dark by men I would never see clearly. "This is a warning, kid." The voice behind the light was flat and bored. A working voice, a man doing a job. "Take the deal. Sign the paper. Nobody wants to see a young fella get hurt out here all alone." A pause. Accidents happen to people who live this far from town. And then the light snapped off and there were footsteps moving away fast through the brush, and an engine somewhere down the dark track turning over and pulling away. And then nothing. Just the night and my own ragged breathing and the soft sound of wet earth still slumping and falling from the torn open wall behind me. I sank down to my knees in the wreckage. I picked up a piece of broken bottle green glass, smooth on one side and sharp on the other, and I held it in my hand, and I felt the whole long summer of work caving in inside my chest, the way the wall had caved outside. This was the lowest I had ever been. Lower than the bus station. Lower than the first night in the dark. Because back then I'd had nothing to lose, and now I had built something. And they had shown me in one night that they could take it whenever they pleased. The despair came down on me total and black. What was the point? What was the point of one boy and two hands against men who came in the dark with crowbars and a decade of money behind them, and the law bent just far enough to serve them? I could rebuild that wall, and they'd come back and break it again and again. They had the time. They had the patience. They had ground down 9 families. What was I against that? I knelt in the broken earth and the broken glass for a long time. I don't know how long. The sky began to gray at the edges, and somewhere in there, kneeling in the ruins of the thing I'd built, I came as close as I ever came to walking away. Closer than the bus station, closer than the first night. I had the thought clear and cold and seductive. Sign the paper. Take whatever they offer. Let them have the dirt. Walk away alive and free, and never look back. And I want you to know that there is no shame in that thought. A man who's been ground down far enough will always think it. The shame is only in what you do next. What I did next was reach inside my jacket where I'd taken to keeping it, and pull out my grandmother's letter, the first one soft now from a summer of folding and unfolding. I couldn't read it in the dark. I didn't need to. I knew the words. If you have found this box, it means you did not turn back. It means there is a part of you, a part of me that is a fighter. And then her other voice from the journal, the one that had carried me through every hard day. Do not look at the whole wall, Wyatt. Look only at the next handful. I looked at the next handful. There it was in the gray dawn light, a fistful of red clay slumped at the base of the broken wall. I reached out, and I picked it up, and I held it cool and dense and heavy in my hand. The same earth, the earth that remembered the earth. No man in a cheap suit with a crowbar could ever truly destroy, because it came from the ground itself. And to the ground it would always return. They could break a wall. They could not break the earth. And they could not break me unless I let them. And I was done right there on my knees in the wreckage, with the green glass cutting my palm, and my grandmother's letter against my heart. I was done letting anyone decide what I was worth. I got up. I didn't feel brave. I want to be honest about that. because I think the men watching this know better than to trust a story where the hero suddenly feels brave. I felt sick and shaky and afraid, and about 100 years old. But I got up and I picked up the bucket, and as the sun came up over the trees, I walked down to the creek to start hauling clay, because the wall had to be rebuilt. And the only way it was going to get rebuilt was the only way anything ever got built. The next handful, and the one after that. I didn't have to do it alone, as it turned out. I'd gone into town that morning bleeding hollow-eyed, half out of my mind, to use the phone at the general store and call Calloway because the old man had told me to call him the second anything happened. And breaking down a wall in the dead of night with a threat about accidents surely counted as anything. Della took one look at me and at my cut-up hand and went white. I told her plain what had happened. I didn't dress it up. She didn't say much. She just nodded slow and her jaw set hard, and she went to the phone behind the counter herself before I could get to it. By noon, 3 trucks had come up my track. Silas Ott was the first with more straw and a face like a thundercloud. Then a younger fellow named Boone, who ran the feed store with his teenage son, and a load of sand he'd hauled up from the creek bottom himself to save my back. Then Della closed it in the middle of a weekday, which I later learned she had not done in 30 years, not for a funeral, not for Christmas, and came up the ridge with sandwiches and a thermos of coffee and her sleeves already rolled. They didn't make speeches. Mountain people don't. Silas walked the length of the broken wall, looked at the damage with a builder's hard eye, spat and said, "Cowards do their work at night." That was the whole speech. Then he picked up a shovel, and we built. I want to tell you about that, because it's the part I think about most all these years later. Not the night they broke it, the day we built it back. There were 6 of us then, 8 then more. Word moved through that town. The way water moves downhill, and people I'd never met came up the ridge that week. An afternoon here, a morning there. A retired mason who showed up unannounced and taught me how to key the new cob into the old, so the seam would never show a pair of sisters who brought a casserole and stayed to tread mud in their bare feet, laughing splattered to the elbow. They treaded the cob. They hauled the buckets. They slapped the wet earth on the wall and smoothed it with their hands. And the broken face of my home rose back up out of the ruin thicker and stronger than before. And Boone's boy found a box of old bottles in his grandmother's cellar, and we set them in the new wall. More of them than before, so that when it was done and the sun came through, my home threw more jewels of light across the floor than it ever had. They had tried to break me by breaking the wall. Instead, they'd done the one thing they never meant to do. They'd shown a boy who'd grown up believing he was alone in the world exactly how wrong he'd always been. It was while we were rebuilding, pulling out the smashed fallen cob to make room for the new, that I found it, down at the very base of the north wall where the original builders had set the foundation against the steel. My shovel struck something that wasn't clay and wasn't concrete. I knelt and dug it out with my fingers. It was a flat tin box, the kind that holds documents, sealed up tight and wrapped in oilcloth, buried right there in the foundation of the hut, where no man would ever find it, unless he had reason to tear the whole wall down to the ground. Buried where only the destruction of the home itself would ever give it up. I waited until the others had gone home that evening. I sat at the wooden table by the light of the lamp, and I worked the lid of that tin box open. And inside, dry and perfect, was a sheaf of papers in my grandmother's hand, and clipped to the top of them an old surveyor's map. It was a map of the county, of the whole ridge, and someone she had marked it up traced over it in her thin, slanting pencil. She'd drawn a line, a long, curving corridor running right across the marked-up land, and along it she'd written a single word underlined twice. And she'd drawn another shape, a wide, irregular blob spreading out under a dozen parcels of landmine in the dead center of it. And that one she'd labeled too. The corridor said highway. The blob said aquifer. And under the map in her own hand was the last letter and the truth that the whole long war had been built to hide. Wyatt, if you are reading this, then they have come for the wall and you tore it open and you found this. I am sorry it took such a thing to bring it to your hand. I could not risk leaving it anywhere a man might find it by looking. I had to leave it where only the destruction of our home would ever uncover it. Because if they ever destroyed our home, you would need this most of all. This is why they want us, Wyatt. This is the why I could never find for so many years. It was never about 5 acres of dirt. The state has been planning a new highway through this county for 15 years. A route worth a fortune to whoever owns the land it crosses. And worth more still, there is water under this ridge. A great deep aquifer, clean and vast, running right beneath our land. In a dry country in years to come, water like that will be worth more than gold. Blackwater is not in the business of land. They are in the business of buying the future cheap from people who do not know what they are sitting on and selling it dear to those who do. They needed us last of all because our parcel sits over the heart of both. The road. The water. Without this land, they have nothing. With it, they have everything. That is why they have hounded one old woman for 10 years. That is why they will not stop. Now you know what I knew. Now you hold what they have been trying to take. Take it to Mr. Calloway. Take it to the court. Let them explain in the daylight in front of a judge why a development company spent a decade terrorizing a widow and a foster child over what they swore was worthless dirt. The light is the thing they cannot survive, Wyatt. Men like this can survive anything but the light. I set the letter down with my hands shaking. It had never been about the debt. It had never been about 5 acres. The whole thing, the lean, the threats, the man with the camera, the crowbars in the dark, all of it had been the long, patient effort of powerful men to take for almost nothing. A fortune that lay hidden in the ground beneath a tin hut, at the end of a dirt road from people too poor and too trusting to know what they were standing on. My grandmother had known. She had figured it out alone over years. And she had buried the proof in the foundation of our home in the one place she knew they'd only reach if they ever tried to destroy us completely. And on the very night they tried, she'd made sure I would find it. I looked at the rebuilt wall through the open doorway, glowing soft red in the last of the light. The new bottles catching the dusk. They had broken it to scare me into signing. And in breaking it, they had handed me the one thing in all the world that could destroy them. The earth remembers. She'd told me that the first night in a letter in the dark. I understood now that she hadn't only meant the clay. I picked up the lamp and I carried the tin box to the cot and I held it against my chest, the way I'd held her letter, and I lay awake a long time, but not with fear. The fear had finally turned all the way over into the thing my grandmother had seen in me before I was ever old enough to know it was there. I was going to take it to the light. I was going to make them stand in a courtroom in front of a judge and a town and explain themselves. I was going to win. And the first frost was already silver on the grass at dawn, which meant the winter she'd told me to survive was coming on at last. But I wasn't afraid of the winter anymore. I had a home with walls 2 feet thick. I had a town at my back. And now at long last I had the truth. The call from Calloway came a week later, and his voice down the line at the general store was tight in a way I'd never heard from him before. They've made their move, Wyatt. The foreclosure hearing's been set. 3 weeks out. A pause, and then something else came into his voice, low and fierce. But son, what you found in that wall, I've been up 2 nights with it. I've practiced law in this county for 40 years. and I have never held a thing like that in my hands. Another pause. It's time. We don't wait anymore. We don't play defense. We take it to them. I hung up the phone and stood in Della's store with my heart going hard. And Della was watching me from behind the counter, and she didn't ask. She just said, "When's the day?" "3 weeks," I said. She nodded slow. "Then you'd best finish that wall." So I finished the wall. Those 3 weeks were the strangest of my whole life. And I think now they were the most important. Because here is the thing about a man waiting for the day that will decide whether he keeps the only home he ever built. He could spend that time pacing or drinking or lying awake running the worst of it over and over behind his eyes. I did some of that, I won't lie, but mostly I worked. I worked because my grandmother's voice was still in me, plain and steady. Look only at the next handful. And the next handful in those 3 weeks was to finish my home before they tried to take it. I closed the last section of the west wall as the first hard frost came down and stayed. And when I stepped back from it on that cold, bright morning, the work was done. The whole hut, every inch of cold, rusted steel wrapped now in living earth, 2 feet thick at the base, curved and smooth and carved with the run of the creek, studded with bottles that threw colored light, with a deep arched doorway you had to stoop to pass through, the way you'd stoop coming into a church. And the inside, Lord, the inside was a different world by then. When I shut that deep door against the November wind, the wind simply stopped. The whole roar and rattle of the weather gone swallowed by 2 feet of earth, replaced by a deep cellar. Quiet so complete you could hear the fire breathing in the stove. And the warmth. The little pot-bellied stove that had struggled all summer to take the chill off a tin tube now filled the whole place with a steady, radiant heat that the thick earthen walls drank in by day and gave back slow all through the night, so that I'd wake in the dark to a home still warm, hours after the fire had burned down to coals. It was a womb. It was a sanctuary. It was the first place in 18 years that was wholly undeniably mine, and I had built it with my own 2 hands out of the very ground, and no man in any suit was going to take it from me without standing in the daylight and telling a judge exactly why. I had survived to the edge of winter. I had done the one task she set me, and now I was ready for the fight she'd been preparing me for since before I could remember. The morning of the hearing, I put on the best I had, clean jeans and a flannel shirt that Silas Ott had left folded on a fence post one cold morning without a word. The way that man left everything. I drove into the county seat with Calloway in his old sedan, the tin box on my lap, my grandmother's journal beside it. The whole weight of 10 years and one summer riding with us down the mountain. The courthouse was an old brick building with a clock tower that hadn't kept time in years. The courtroom inside was small and formal and smelled of floor wax and old paper. And across the aisle when we came in sat 2 men in suits that cost more than everything I owned put together. They had soft hands and easy postures, and the bored, certain faces of men who had done this many times and never once lost. Beside them sat their lawyer, a sleek city man with a leather folder. They glanced at me when I walked in, a sunburned kid in a borrowed flannel shirt, and I watched them decide in that single glance that I was no one, that this would be quick. The wolves, just like she'd written, right down to the suits. The judge was a stern, gray-haired woman named Whitmore with reading glasses on a chain and a way of looking over the top of them that quieted the whole room. She read the matter into the record in a flat, even voice. Blackwater Land and Development versus Wyatt Holloway. A petition for foreclosure on an outstanding lien. $25,000. A simple matter the way she read it. A debt unpaid. A property to be seized. Their lawyer stood first, and he made it sound like nothing at all. The debt was on record. The defendant had made no payment. His client was regrettably but lawfully entitled to foreclose and recover the property. He spoke for maybe 4 minutes. He sat down. It was clean and clinical and final, and the two men behind him did not even bother to hide their small, satisfied smiles. Then Calloway rose, and the old man did not argue about the debt. I'd wondered if he would if he'd stand up and contest the $25,000 line by line the way I'd half expected. He didn't. He left the debt sitting there. Instead, the old country lawyer who'd practiced 40 years in that little county did something I will never forget. He told a story. "Your Honor," he said, "before this court decides whether to put a young man out of his home, I'd ask the court to hear how he came to have one." And he told them. He told them about an old woman named Marin Holloway who took in her orphaned grandson and loved him, and who gave him up not because she didn't want him, but because men working for the company sitting at that very table had made it clear that the boy was a target as long as he stayed. He told them about the choice she made to send the only family she had left into the cold of the foster system so that he might be safe. He held up her journal, and he read into the record in his slow, steady voice the dates and the names and the threats she'd written down faithfully for 10 years. The blocked phone calls, the man at the gate with the camera. Property changes hands all the time, ma'am, one way or another. The smiles across the aisle had stopped. He put up a list then on a stand where the judge could see it. A list of names. 12 families across that county who'd sold to Blackwater and left sold cheap under pressure after the calls and the letters and the leaning. He named the Tillmans. He named families I'd never heard of and families I'd come to know, 9 of them off our ridge alone. And then he put up the first photograph. It was a picture of the Quonset hut as it had been the day I arrived. I'd nearly forgotten how it looked. Rusted in long weeping streaks, crooked stovepipe, a cracked window grimed black, a derelict tin can rotting in a clearing at the end of a dirt road. "This," Calloway said quietly, "is the property Blackwater Land and Development asks this court to award them. A worthless, abandoned shell on 5 acres of overgrown dirt. That's the story they'd like the court to believe. Worthless dirt and a derelict shed and a debt to be collected." He let that sit. Then he put up the second photograph. I had taken it myself a week before on a borrowed camera in the gold of a late afternoon. It showed my home, the earthen walls glowing warm red in the sun, soft and curved and carved with the lines of the creek, the bottles catching the light like set jewels, the deep arched doorway and a thin curl of wood smoke rising up out of the chimney into a clean blue sky. A soft sound went through the courtroom. The clerk, someone in the gallery, even Judge Whitmore behind her glasses went still. It didn't look like a worthless shed. It looked like a home. It looked like the most loved, most worked over, most alive home you ever saw. "And this," said Calloway, and his voice rang now full and unhurried, "is what my client built, with his own 2 hands, out of the clay of that very ground, in one summer, with no money and no help but what the good people of this county chose to give him. He invested no fortune in this land, Your Honor. He had no fortune. He invested his sweat and his blood and his blistered hands and his whole young heart. He took a thing they called worthless, and he made it the most valuable thing a man can own, a home." He turned and looked for the first time directly at the 2 men across the aisle. "Blackwater is not trying to collect a debt. They are trying to steal a man's home, and I intend to show this court exactly why." That was when he turned to me. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Wyatt Holloway." My heart was slamming against my ribs as I walked to the stand and sat down and swore the oath. The wood of the witness chair was hard under me. The whole room was looking at me. The judge, the gallery, the two soft-handed men, and their sleek lawyer who rose now and came toward me with a thin, patient smile, ready to take a sunburned 18-year-old apart. He tried. I'll give him that. He worked at me for a good while. He tried to paint me as a squatter, a drifter, an irresponsible kid playing house on land he had no right to and no means to keep. He asked about my record. He asked about the debt. He asked with a little smile whether I really expected the court to believe a foster kid with no education could have built such a thing, or whether perhaps I'd simply found it that way. And I just told the truth. I'd been so afraid the whole drive down that I'd freeze up, that I'd stammer and shrink the way I'd learned to shrink in front of every adult who held my fate in their hands. But something had changed in me out there on the ridge, somewhere between the first bucket of clay and the night they broke the wall, and the morning the whole town came up the mountain to build it back. I wasn't a boy waiting to be told what he was worth anymore. I knew what I was worth. I'd built it. So I told them. I told them about the cold of the first night, and the formless terror of the dark, and how close I'd come to walking away. I told them about finding my grandmother's box and reading why she'd sent me away, and what it does to a man to learn at 18 that the great wound of his life had been an act of love all along. I told them about the clay and the treading of it barefoot under the summer sun, and the blisters in Silas Ott's 2 bales of straw, and Della's bag of apples on the first day, and the colored bottles I set in the wall to catch the light. I told them about the night 2 men came in the dark with crowbars and broke the face of my home, and told me accidents happen to people who live far from town. And I told them what I found in the wreckage, the tin box my grandmother had buried in the foundation, in the one place a man would only reach if he tried to destroy the home completely. And then Calloway asked me quiet to tell the court what was in the box. I looked at the judge, and I looked at the 2 men in their fine suits, and I watched the easy certainty drain right out of their faces as I said the words. A surveyor's map, a planned highway corridor running straight across the land, and an aquifer, a great deep vein of clean water running beneath the whole ridge, beneath a dozen parcels with mine in the dead center of it. My grandmother figured it out, I said, years ago, alone. That's why they wanted us. It was never 5 acres of dirt. It was the road and the water under it worth a fortune, and they were buying it cheap off people too poor to know what they were standing on. She buried the proof in the foundation of our home so that even if they took everything, the truth would still be there. She left it for me to find. I looked right at the men across the aisle, and I found it the night they broke my wall to scare me into signing. The courtroom was dead silent. Calloway entered the map into evidence. He entered the journal. He laid out page by page the whole architecture of it. 15 years of a development firm quietly assembling a fortune in highway right-of-way and water rights parcel by leaning on the poorest families in the county and counting on no one ever connecting the dots. When I stepped down from that stand, my legs were shaking, but I held my head up, and as I passed the table where the 2 men sat, I saw that they were not smiling anymore. They were not looking at anyone. They were leaning together with their lawyer, murmuring fast and low, and there was something in their faces I had never expected to see there. Fear. The light is the thing they cannot survive, my grandmother had written. Men like this can survive anything but the light. Judge Whitmore took a recess. We waited in the hall, Calloway and me, and behind us, filling the benches, half the town of Millhaven, who had closed their stores and left their farms to drive down the mountain and sit in that courtroom for a boy most of them had known only one summer. Della, Silas, Boone and his son. The sisters who treaded mud in their bare feet. People I'd never even spoken to. They didn't say much to me. Mountain people don't. But Silas put one hard hand on my shoulder as we waited and left it there a moment. And that was worth more than any speech. When we were called back, and the judge took her seat and looked out over that packed little courtroom for a long moment over the top of her glasses, and then she began to speak. "In the matter of this lien," she said, and her voice was even and hard, "I find that the circumstances under which it was created are deeply suspect. A debt signed by a desperate man under what the evidence strongly suggests was coercion, then attached to a property after its owner refused for over a decade to sell. That alone would give this court pause." She set down the papers. "But the more pressing issue before me is not the debt. It is one of equity. The law is not merely a machine for the enforcement of contracts. It is also, and the public forgets this to its sorrow, a guardian of fundamental fairness." She turned and looked directly at the two men in their fine suits, and I watched them shrink under it. "To allow this petitioner to foreclose," she said, "to seize a home that this young man has poured his very soul into with his own two hands over the course of a single summer, in exchange for a debt of $25,000, that this court finds deeply questionable, and which appears to be nothing more than a pretext to acquire land of enormous undisclosed value, would be more than an error. It would be a profound miscarriage of justice. It would be, in the plainest word this court can find, unconscionable." She brought the gavel down, and the crack of it went through me like lightning. "The petition for foreclosure is denied." A sound broke out behind me, the whole town letting go its breath at once, and the judge raised a hand, and the room went quiet again, because she wasn't finished. "Furthermore," she said, "based on the evidence presented in this courtroom today, I am referring this matter to the Office of the State Attorney General, with a recommendation for a full investigation into the business practices of Blackwater Land and Development and any parent entity thereof. The court is adjourned." The gavel came down a second time, and it was over. I had won. I have stood in a lot of rooms in my life in the years since, some of them grand. I have never again felt anything like the walk out of that little brick courthouse into the cold November sun. Calloway had his arm around my shoulders and was laughing, actually laughing, the old man, tears standing in his eyes. The two men in suits hurried past us and down the steps, without a word, their easy certainty gone to ash, their lawyer trailing behind them, with his leather folder clutched to his chest. And the whole town of Millhaven came pouring out of that courthouse around me, and Della grabbed me in a fierce, hard hug that knocked the wind out of me, and Silas Ott shook my hand, and then Awkward pulled me into a one-armed embrace. This man carved out of root and stone and held on a second longer than he meant to. I had done more than save my home. I'd stood up to the men who'd been grinding this county into the dirt for 15 years, and I'd beaten them in the daylight in front of God and a judge and everyone. For them. For her. For a town full of people who'd been leaned on so long they'd forgotten anyone could push back. The aftermath came quick, and it came hard, and it was a thing to see. The Attorney General's office did not move gently. They moved like men who'd been waiting years for someone to hand them a thread to pull. And the thread my grandmother had wound alone over a decade in a tin hut. Every dated phone call, every threatening letter, every name, the whole patient record of it, unraveled the entire thing. Within a few months, Blackwater Land and Development was dissolved. Its assets frozen, the parent company behind it, dragged blinking into the light of a dozen newspapers and an open investigation. The lien on my land simply vanished the way a shadow vanishes when you finally turn on the lamp, as though it had never been. The families who'd sold under pressure, some of them got their day too in the proceedings that followed. The water under that ridge, the road that may or may not ever come, all of it stayed exactly where it belonged, with the people who lived on the land. The 5 acres were finally truly mine. Clean, free. Just earth and a home built of it, and a debt that had never been mine to begin with, gone to nothing. And then, slowly at first, and then all at once, the story got out. I don't know how these things travel. A local paper ran a piece, the Mud Hut Boy they called me, which I hated and which stuck. Then a magazine about natural building sent a writer up the ridge, and she walked through my home with her hand pressed flat against the cool, thick walls, marveling, asking how an 18-year-old with no training had built something that architects spend careers chasing. An architect from the city actually drove out unannounced just to stand inside it, and he stayed 2 hours. And when he left, he shook my hand and said he'd been building houses for 30 years and had never once made anything that felt the way that little hut felt. And then the offers started coming. Not from developers this time. The developers were finished. These came from regular people, strangers captivated by the story, by the idea of this strange, beautiful, hand-built home of earth at the end of a dirt road. The first offer was for $100,000, and I laughed out loud when Calloway read it to me. A real laugh, the first in a long while. $100,000 for a tin hut I'd covered in mud. The second was for $250,000. And then the last one came. A wealthy couple from out west somewhere. People with more money than they knew what to do with, and a head full of dreams about escaping the city for something real. They drove all the way out to see it. They walked through my home and went quiet the way people went quiet in it. And the woman cried a little, and they didn't haggle. $500,000, cash. $500,000. I want you to sit with that number, the way I had to sit with it. Because if you've lived any kind of life at all, you know what a number like that means when you've spent your whole existence counting out a state allowance dollar by dollar in the dark. It was a number so large I couldn't hold it in my head. It was a house anywhere I wanted. It was college if I wanted it. It was travel security ease, a whole different life. The kind of life I had never once in 18 years allowed myself to even imagine, because hoping for it would have been a way of getting hurt. I could walk away from this patch of dirt and never worry about money again as long as I lived. This was the last test. The one she'd warned me about on the very first day on a sidewalk outside the bus station, in a letter I'd read with the noise of the city washing over me. There are wolves who will come around dressed in fine suits, and they will offer you what sounds like a fortune for your dirt. Do not listen to them. These weren't wolves, these were kind people with an honest checkbook. But the test was the same. The test had never really been about who was offering. It had always been about what I'd say. I sat with that offer for a week. I let it lie there on the wooden table, and every day I'd pick it up and read the number again, and every day I'd put it back down and go walk my land. And I did walk it that week. All 5 acres of it. I walked down to the creek where I'd hauled 10,000 buckets of clay and knelt at the water and remembered the boy I'd been the first morning, sneakers worn through, holding a fistful of red earth like he was holding his own salvation. I walked the old garden plot my grandmother had tilled for years, and that I'd cleared and replanted where green things were coming up out of ground. She'd worked with her own hands before me. I touched the trees she'd touched. And every evening I came back to my home and stooped through the deep arched doorway and shut the door, and the wind stopped, and the cellar quiet folded over me, and I'd sit by the stove in the warm red dark and watch the last of the day come through the bottles in the wall and throw its colored light across the floor. And I thought about the money. I really did. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I didn't, because the men listening to this have all sat with a number that could change everything, and they know a man who pretends he wasn't tempted is a man who's lying about something. It was freedom. That's what the money was. A ticket out to an easier life. But I kept asking myself, an easier life, doing what? living where in some apartment in some city I'd never seen that some other man had built surrounded by people who didn't know my name. I'd already had that life. I'd had 18 years of it. A life of waiting. A life of being moved from one room to the next by people who decided things about me without ever once asking. A passenger's life. Here on this ridge in this strange, beautiful house of earth, I wasn't a passenger anymore. I was the builder. I was the maker. I was, for the first time in my whole life, the one who decided. This place wasn't property. I understood that sitting there in the warm dark at the end of that week. It wasn't acreage and a structure and a market value. It was a record of my own survival written in clay. Every lump and swirl in those walls was a day I'd refuse to quit. Every bottle set in the cob was a small jewel of hope I'd pressed into the earth with my own hand on a lonely evening. The very warmth coming off that stove and held in those thick walls wasn't just heat. It was the feeling of safety, the first I'd ever known. And I had not been given it. I had forged it. Out of dirt and straw and stubbornness and a dead woman's faith in a boy she swore was a fighter. How do you sell that? How do you put a price on the place that saved your life? How do you take a check? However large, in exchange for the one thing in all the world that ever taught you who you were. On the morning the offer was set to expire, I called the realtor from Della's store. "I'm going to pass," I said. There was a silence on the line, and then he started in the way I knew he would. He told me I was making a mistake. I'd regret the rest of my life. He told me opportunities like this came once. He told me not unkindly that I was a young man who'd been through a great deal and maybe wasn't thinking straight. And that nobody, he said, turns down $500,000. "I know," I said, and I looked out the window of the general store down the main street of the little town that had come up the mountain to build my wall back toward the gravel road that climbed away east into the trees toward home. I'm keeping it. And when I hung up that phone, I felt no regret, not a flicker of doubt. I felt something I'd been chasing my whole life without ever knowing its name. I felt peace. The wolves had come dressed in fine suits, just like she said they would. First with crowbars in the dark, and last with a checkbook in the daylight. And I had not faltered at either one. I had passed the test. I had earned my inheritance, and it was never $500,000. It was a home. I'm an old man now telling you this. My hands are not what they were, though the calluses never fully went all these years later. And on a cold morning, I can still feel every bucket of clay I ever carried up that slope. The little hut is still standing. It will outlast me. Cob built right will stand 1,000 years. And I built it right with a town's help, and a dead woman's manual, and the slow, hard teaching of the earth itself. I raised a family inside those warm red walls. I buried good neighbors and made new ones. Silas Ott is gone now, and Della too, and Calloway, that good old country lawyer years back. But the home they helped me build is still warm. In the winter, still cool in the heat of August, still throws colored jewels of light across the floor when the late sun comes through the bottles in the wall. I never did meet my father. He never came. Some stories don't tie up the way you want them to, and I made my peace with that one a long time ago. But I came to understand him a little through everything my grandmother wrote. A weak man caught by strong and wicked ones who ran, because running was all he had. I don't hate him. You can't carry hate that long and build anything good with the same hands. The scars from those years in the system, they never fully left either. I still mourn the mother I barely remember, and the grandmother I never truly got to know in this life, only through her hand on a page and her faith reaching out across death to catch a falling boy. Those scars are part of my story, but they were never the whole of it. The whole of it is this, that the most broken things in this world can be made whole again, not by replacing them, not by throwing them out and starting over, but by wrapping them in something new, something strong, something grown up out of the ground itself. A rusted tin can became a home. An abandoned boy became a man with roots. A debt meant to bury me became the thing I used to stand. That's the truth I built my whole life on after I tore down the lie I'd carried for 12 years. Inheritance isn't what you're handed. It's what you choose to build with it. So I'll ask you the same thing I've asked myself every morning of a long life, looking out at the sun coming up over those trees my grandmother knew. What have you built? It doesn't have to be a house. Maybe it's a marriage you fought to keep when it would have been easier to walk. Maybe it's a child you raised right. Maybe it's just a quiet, hard-won peace you made with a life that didn't go the way you planned. We are all of us builders, every one. We are all survivors of something. And the man who told me that, well, no. No man told me that. An old woman did in a letter I read on a bench in a bus station, 18 years old, with everything I owned in a bag at my feet, and no idea on earth what I was about to build. She was right about me in the end. She was right that there was a fighter in there somewhere, waiting on the ground beneath a tin hut for a boy to come and dig it out. Be brave, she wrote. I tried, grandmother. All these years I tried, and the home you left me is still standing.